brass bell above the pawn shop door rang at exactly 4:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in March of 2025, and somewhere across town, in a beige living room that still smelled like the lemon furniture polish my mother had used since 1994, my younger sister was holding up a small velvet box and laughing about what she had just done with the only thing of my late husband I had left. I did not know any of this yet. I was sitting in my office on the 12th floor of a glass building in downtown Phoenix, reviewing quarterly numbers for the 47th location I had opened just 6 weeks earlier, sipping cold coffee from a paper cup, and waiting for the phone call that would split my life into a before and an after. My name is Wren Holloway. I am 34 years old, and for the last 3 years I have been a widow who learned how to smile in public and fall apart only in parking lots. My husband Daniel died on a rainy Thursday in October of 2022, 8 days after our second wedding anniversary, in a car accident on the I-10 that the police report described in language so clean and clinical that I read it twice before I understood that the man I loved was not coming home. He left me 2 things that mattered. The first was a small chain of pawn shops he had quietly built from one storefront in Mesa into a regional business across Arizona and Nevada, a company he had run out of a back office that smelled like old leather and machine oil. The second was his wedding ring, a plain band of brushed white gold with the date of our wedding engraved on the inside in tiny script that you had to tilt toward the light to read. I had kept that ring in a velvet box on the top shelf of the closet in our bedroom for 2.5 years. I did not wear it. I could not bring myself to put it on a chain around my neck the way some widows do, because every time I touched it, I could feel the cold of the morgue all over again, and I needed somewhere safe to put that cold so it would not follow me into the rest of my life. The box sat on that shelf behind a folded gray sweater that Daniel had bought me the Christmas before he died, and I checked on it the way other people check on a sleeping child, just to know it was still there, still breathing in its own quiet way. My sister Marlo knew where I kept it. She knew because she had been in my house the previous Saturday, the 8th of March, helping me sort through a box of old photographs that our grandmother had left behind when she passed in January. Marlo is 2 years younger than me, 32, and she has spent the entirety of her adult life convinced that the universe owes her something specific that it keeps forgetting to deliver. She had asked that Saturday afternoon if she could borrow a sweater from my closet because the air conditioning in my house was set too low for her taste. And I had said yes without thinking, because I have been saying yes to Marlo without thinking since we were children, and our mother taught me that the older sister gives and the younger sister receives, and that is simply how the world is arranged. She must have seen the box that afternoon. She must have opened it, lifted the ring out, and decided something in that moment that she did not share with me until 4 days later, on a Wednesday evening when she called and asked if I could come over to our parents' house for dinner, because there was something the family needed to discuss. I said yes to that too, because I always said yes, and because I had spent the 3 years since Daniel died trying to convince our parents that I was fine, that I did not need them to worry, that I had a steady job at what they believed was a regional retail company, and that I was managing the grief in a healthy and contained way. They did not know what I owned. They did not know that when Daniel died, his lawyer had walked me through a folder of documents in a quiet conference room and explained that I was now the sole owner of 41 pawn shop locations valued at just under $23 million, and that I had spent the 2.5 years since then quietly expanding the business to 47 locations, because work was the only thing that kept my hands from shaking in the morning. I had not told my parents, because my mother had a habit of redistributing other people's resources according to her own private accounting system, and my father had a habit of supporting whatever my mother decided. And I had learned in my 20s that the safest version of my life was the one they knew the least about. So when I drove over to their house that Wednesday evening, the 12th of March, I expected nothing more dramatic than a conversation about whether I was dating yet, or whether I had thought about selling Daniel and my house and moving into something smaller, or whether I had finally agreed to come to the church my mother had been attending since 2018. I parked my car on the street because the driveway was full, walked up the concrete path past the rose bushes my father had been pruning since I was in elementary school, and let myself in through the front door without knocking, Because that was the rule in our family. The front door is always unlocked, and you do not knock on the door of the house where you grew up. The living room smelled like pot roast and lemon polish, and the three of them were already sitting on the long beige sofa with the floral throw pillows that my mother had owned since the early 90s. My father had a glass of iced tea on the coaster in front of him. My mother had her hands folded in her lap. Marlo was sitting between them with a small velvet box on her knee. And the moment I saw that box, the moment my eyes registered the specific shade of midnight blue and the specific size, and the specific way the corners had worn soft from years of being touched by my hands, the room tilted very gently sideways and then righted itself again. I did not say anything at first. I walked across the carpet and sat down in the armchair across from the sofa and put my purse on the floor next to my feet, and I waited, because in our family, the older sister waits and the younger sister speaks. Marlo smiled at me. It was the same smile she had used when she was 9 years old and had eaten the last piece of birthday cake that our mother had specifically saved for me. The same smile she had used when she was 16 and had crashed my first car into a mailbox and told our father it was my fault for parking it crooked. The same smile that had been the prelude to every small theft and large betrayal of our shared childhood. She lifted the box. She turned it slowly in her fingers so the velvet caught the light. She said, in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly proud, that she had taken something of mine from my closet on Saturday afternoon, and she had walked it into a pawn shop on Indian School Road on Tuesday at 4:17 in the afternoon, and she had handed it across the counter to a clerk in a blue polo shirt. And she had received in exchange a small white ticket and an envelope containing $1,100 in cash that she had already spent on a weekend trip to Sedona with her boyfriend Pierce. She said, and I am quoting her exactly because the sentence has lived in the front of my mind every day since, "I pawned the wedding ring of your dead husband, and it is just gathering dust in your closet anyway." My mother nodded along to this confession the way she nodded along to the sermon on Sundays, her chin moving in small, precise dips of agreement, and she added in her own calm voice that I was too broke to buy it back anyway, so it did not really matter what Marlo had done with it. My father, who had not looked up from his iced tea for the entirety of the conversation, finally raised his eyes and said, in the flat Midwestern tone he had used to discipline us as children, that I needed to stop crying over the junk of a widow, because Daniel had been gone for 3 years and it was time for me to grow up. I was not crying, that was the strange part. I was sitting in the armchair with my hands resting very still on the armrests, and I was looking at the three of them, and I was thinking about the brass bell above the pawn shop door on Indian School Road, and I was thinking about the security camera mounted in the corner of that store that recorded everything in high definition. And I was thinking about the fact that the clerk in the blue polo shirt, who had taken my ring across the counter at 4:17 on Tuesday afternoon, was a young man named Devin Castellanos, who had been working for my company for 14 months, and who sent me a personal email every Friday with his weekly numbers. I reached down into my purse and I took out my phone. The phone in my hand felt heavier than it should have, the way ordinary objects do in moments when your whole life is about to pivot on a single small decision. And I held it for what could not have been more than 4 seconds, while the three of them watched me from the sofa with the patient expressions of people who believed they had already won a conversation that had not actually started yet. My mother was the first to speak into the silence. She told me to put the phone away because there was no one I could call who would help me, and the bank would not give me a loan with my salary, and Marlo was not going to give the ticket back because she had already cashed the money and spent it. And I needed to accept that this was a lesson the family had decided to teach me about hoarding sentimental objects when I should have been moving forward with my life. I let her finish. I have learned, over the course of 34 years as the daughter of my mother, that the only way to survive a conversation with her is to let her arrive at the end of her own sentences without interruption, because interrupting only causes her to start over from the beginning with more conviction. When she was done, I asked Marlo a single question. I asked her which location she had taken the ring to. She tilted her head at me as if the question was a trick, and then she smiled again, that same 9-year-old birthday cake smile. And she told me the address on Indian School Road, the one with the green awning, the one that had been there since before our family moved to Phoenix in the late 90s. I knew the store. I knew the exact square footage of the floor space, the exact placement of the security cameras, the exact name of every employee on the schedule that Tuesday afternoon, because I had personally signed off on the renovation of that location in the spring of 2024 when we expanded the jewelry display case along the back wall. I knew that Devin Castellanos had been the shift supervisor on duty at 4:17 on Tuesday, the 11th of March, because the shift schedule for all 47 of my locations was synced to my phone, and I had glanced at it on Tuesday evening while I was eating a salad at my kitchen counter and thinking about nothing in particular. I opened the phone. I did not open it dramatically, I just opened it the way you open a phone, with my thumb on the home button and the screen lighting up and the familiar wallpaper showing a photograph of Daniel and me on a beach in San Diego from the summer of 2021. I tapped on the messaging app, and I scrolled to the thread labeled Phoenix District Managers, and I typed a short message, and I sent it before any of the three people on the sofa had finished reading the expression on my face. The message said, "Please pull the full intake records from the Indian School Road location for Tuesday afternoon between 4 and 5 p.m., including the security footage and the item description and the customer identification on file, and forward everything to my personal email within the next 10 minutes." I put the phone face down on the arm of the chair. I looked up. Marlo was still smiling, but the smile had developed a small wrinkle in one corner, the way a piece of paper develops a wrinkle when you fold it and then try to unfold it and pretend it was never folded. My mother asked me what I was doing on my phone, and I told her I was sending a work email, and she made a small disapproving sound because she believed that work should not be conducted in the living room of a family home during a serious family conversation. And then she pivoted back to the original subject and began to explain to me, slowly and carefully as if I were a small child, why what Marlo had done was actually a kind of favor. She said that I had been clinging to the memory of Daniel in a way that was not healthy, and that the ring had become a kind of anchor that was holding me down, and that by removing it from my closet and turning it into cash, Marlo had actually freed me from a burden I had been too sentimental to release on my own. She said that Pierce, the boyfriend of Marlo, was a wonderful young man who had been very patient with the financial difficulties they had been experiencing, and that the trip to Sedona had been a much-needed break for the two of them, and that I should be glad that something useful had come out of an object that had no practical value. She said the word useful with a particular emphasis, as if it was the moral center of her entire argument. I listened to all of this without saying a word. I have a face, when I am working, that I have spent years cultivating, a face that gives away nothing, a face that lets the person across the table from me believe they are winning a negotiation that they have actually already lost. I wore that face in the living room while my mother explained the moral framework of my own theft to me, and I watched my father nod along, and I watched Marlo regain her confidence one small increment at a time, and I waited for my phone to vibrate against the fabric of the armrest. It vibrated at 6 minutes past the hour. I picked it up, I unlocked it. I opened the email from Devin Castellanos that contained a PDF attachment of the intake form, a JPEG of the security still photograph showing my sister standing at the counter holding the velvet box, a copy of the front and back of the driver license of Marlo that she had presented as identification, and a short note from Devin that said, "Ma'am, I recognize the engraving on the ring as the same engraving from the photograph in your office." And I flagged the item as a hold rather than processing it for the floor. "The ring is in the safe, and I have not put it out for sale. Please let me know how you want to proceed." I read the email twice. I closed the email. I looked up at the three of them on the sofa, and I felt something inside my chest unlock that had been locked for 3 years, not in a violent way, not in a way that hurt, but in the quiet way a door unlocks when you finally remember where you put the key. I asked Marlo, in the same calm voice she had used to confess her crime, whether she would mind handing me the ticket. She blinked. She looked at our mother. Our mother told her not to give me anything, because the ticket was the only leverage Marlo had, and if I wanted the ring back, I was going to have to come up with the $1,100 plus interest, plus a public apology to the family for being so dramatic about a piece of jewelry. I almost laughed. I did not, because the moment was too important to laugh through, but the impulse was there, and it sat in my throat like a small bright bird. I told my mother that I was not going to apologize for anything, and I told my father that I was not crying over the junk of a widow because I was not crying at all. And I told Marlo that I was going to ask her one more time, very politely, to hand me the ticket, and if she did not, I was going to make a different kind of phone call that none of them were going to enjoy. Marlo looked at our mother again. Our mother nodded firmly, the way she had nodded when she sent us to our rooms as children, the way she had nodded when she told me at the age of 19 that I needed to break up with my college boyfriend because he was not from the right kind of family, the way she had nodded at every fork in the road of my life where she had chosen the path she wanted me to walk. Marlo slipped the ticket into the front pocket of her jeans, and she crossed her arms over her chest, and she told me to go ahead and make whatever call I wanted, because no one in this room was afraid of me. I picked the phone up again. I dialed a number from memory, the direct line to my chief operating officer, a woman named Imani Brockwell who had worked for Daniel since 2017 and for me since 2022. And when she picked up on the second ring, I asked her in a calm voice to pull the customer intake records, every single one, for all 47 locations across the last 7 days, and to put a corporate hold on the ring at the Indian School Road store, and to have legal draft a letter under my name as owner of the chain. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Imani said, "Of course, Mrs. Halloway, I will have everything to you within the hour." The room went absolutely silent. My mother set her iced tea glass down on the coaster with a small, careful click. My father slowly raised his eyes from his lap. Marlo stared at me with her mouth slightly open. And for the first time in my entire life inside that beige living room, I had the floor. The silence stretched for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 12 or 13 seconds, and in those seconds, I watched my mother do the math behind her eyes, the small, careful subtraction of everything she thought she knew about me from everything she had just heard come out of my mouth. She had heard the words owner of the chain. She had heard the words 47 locations. She had heard her own daughter referred to as Mrs. Halloway by a voice on the other end of a phone line that carried the unmistakable crispness of corporate authority. And she was now sitting on her own beige sofa, trying to reassemble the picture of me she had been carrying in her head for 34 years, using these new and incompatible pieces. My father spoke first, because my father always spoke first when my mother had been knocked off balance. He cleared his throat in the particular way he did before he was about to dismiss something that frightened him, and he said that he did not understand what I was talking about, and that I was clearly trying to scare Marlo into giving the ticket back by pretending to be more important than I actually was. He said the word pretending with a small bitter laugh, the kind of laugh that was designed to bring my mother back into the conversation as an ally. And my mother obliged him by nodding firmly and telling me that I should not lie about my job to win a family argument, because lying would only make things worse for me in the long run. I considered, for a brief moment, whether to explain myself in detail, whether to walk them through the timeline of how Daniel had built the company and how he had left it to me and how I had grown it. I decided against it. There is a particular kind of person who does not believe the truth even when it is sitting in front of them with documentation attached, and my parents had spent 34 years training me to recognize that kind of person, and I was not going to waste my breath converting them now. Instead, I turned my phone around and I held the screen out toward Marlo so she could see the security still photograph of herself standing at the counter on Indian School Road. Her own face captured in high resolution, her own hand holding the velvet box, the timestamp visible in the bottom right corner. Marlo leaned forward. She squinted at the screen. The color drained out of her face in stages, first from her cheeks and then from her forehead and then from her lips, until she looked like a photograph of herself that had been left out in the sun too long. She said, in a small voice that did not match the voice she had been using a few minutes earlier, that I could have gotten that picture from anywhere. I told her that the email it had come from was from Devin Castellanos, the shift supervisor at the store, and that if she wanted, I could put him on speakerphone right now and he could confirm what I was saying. She did not want me to put him on speakerphone. She sat back against the floral pillows, and she pulled the ticket out of her pocket, and she turned it over in her fingers. And I watched her perform the mental calculation that all small thieves perform when they realize they have stolen from the wrong person. She was trying to figure out how to give the ticket back to me without admitting that she had ever taken anything in the first place. Because admitting it would mean unraveling the entire story, she had just told our parents about how she had done me a favor by liberating me from a sentimental burden. My mother, sensing the shift in the room, tried to recover her authority by changing the subject. She said that even if I did have some kind of job at the pawn shop company, that did not give me the right to threaten my own sister, and that family was more important than any business, and that I should not let a piece of metal come between me and the people who had raised me. She used the phrase, the people who had raised me, with the particular emphasis she always used. The phrase that was designed to remind me of every meal she had cooked, and every bandage she had applied, and every piece of homework she had checked. The phrase that was the foundation of every guilt trip she had ever sent me on. I told her, very quietly, that the people who had raised me had also just spent the last 20 minutes telling me that my dead husband was junk, and that I was too broke to matter, and that my grief was an inconvenience to be managed by stealing from me, and that none of those things sounded like the behavior of people who loved me. I said it without raising my voice. I said it the way I might have said something across a conference table to a vendor who was trying to overcharge us. And the calm of my own voice surprised me almost as much as it surprised them, because for the first time in my life, I was speaking to my mother without the small tremor in my throat that had always been there. The tremor that meant I was preparing to apologize at the end of whatever sentence I was speaking. There was no apology coming this time. My mother heard it in my voice before she heard it in my words. She straightened her spine against the back of the sofa, and she folded her hands more tightly in her lap, and she said, in the cold voice she reserved for the worst arguments of our childhood, that if I was going to talk to her like that in her own house, I could leave. She said it the way she had said it when I was 17, and had told her I was applying to colleges out of state, instead of the local university she had picked out for me. The way she had said it when I was 24, and had announced that I was marrying Daniel even though she did not approve of his background. The way she had said it every time I had tried to choose my own life over the life she had drafted for me. In the past, that sentence had always worked. In the past, I had always backed down, had always apologized, had always softened my position until I was small enough to fit back inside the version of me that my mother could tolerate. I did not back down this time. I stood up from the armchair, I picked up my purse from the floor, and I walked across the carpet toward Marlowe, and I held out my hand for the ticket. I did not say anything. I just held out my hand, palm up, fingers slightly curved, the way you hold out a hand to a child who is holding something they should not be holding. Marlowe looked at our mother for permission. Our mother did not give her any. Our mother was now staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, an expression that was somewhere between fury and fear, and she could not look away from me long enough to coach Marlowe through the next move. So Marlowe, who had spent her entire life looking to our mother for instructions, was suddenly without a script. She held the ticket in her fingers. She looked at me. She looked at our father, who was staring at the carpet. She looked back at the ticket. And then she did the thing I had not expected her to do, the thing that told me, in that single small motion, exactly what kind of person she had become while I was not paying attention. She crumpled the ticket in her fist, and she shoved it down between the sofa cushions. She said, with a thin, defiant smile, that I could go ahead and try to claim the ring without the ticket, and that without the ticket, the store had no obligation to return the item to anyone, and that she was not going to make it easy for me to undo what she had done. She had clearly been thinking, in the few seconds since I had stood up, about how to retain some kind of leverage in the situation, and she had landed on the idea that the physical ticket was the only thing standing between me and my husband ring, and that as long as she controlled that ticket, she controlled the outcome. She did not understand the business. She did not understand that a pawn ticket is a courtesy document, not a deed, and that the actual record of the transaction was sitting in a database that I could access from my phone, and that the item itself was already on hold in the safe at the Indian School Road location under my personal authorization. She did not understand that the small piece of paper in the sofa cushions was, in the moment she crumpled it, worth nothing at all. I did not explain this to her. I just looked at her for a long, quiet second, and I said, in a voice that surprised me with how level it was, that she was going to regret that. Then I turned and I walked out of the living room and down the hallway and out the front door, and I did not look back, because for the first time in my life, I did not need to. I sat in my car at the curb for a long time before I started the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my forehead pressed lightly against the cool plastic, and I listened to the sound of my own breathing in the way that grief counselors had taught me to listen to it during the months after Daniel died. The street was quiet. The sun was setting behind the row of palm trees on the opposite side, and the orange light was hitting the windshield in long horizontal bars, and somewhere down the block, a sprinkler was clicking on for its evening cycle. I thought about my husband. I thought about the morning we had gotten engaged, in the small garden behind the rented house we had been living in at the time, and how he had not gotten down on one knee because he had hurt his knee playing basketball the week before, and how he had instead held both my hands in his and asked me to marry him while standing perfectly upright like he was making a business proposal, and how I had laughed and cried at the same time and said yes. I thought about the ring. I thought about the night, 6 months into our marriage, when he had taken it off to wash the dishes and had set it on the kitchen windowsill, and how I had panicked the next morning when he could not find it, and how we had torn the kitchen apart for 2 hours before discovering that it had fallen behind the trash can, and how he had laughed and put it back on his finger and made me a promise that night that he would never take it off again. He had kept that promise. He had been wearing the ring on the night of the accident. The hospital had handed it back to me in a small clear plastic bag, along with his wallet and his watch, and the key fob to the truck that had been totaled on the I-10, and I had taken the bag home and put it in the closet and not opened it for 11 months. When I finally opened it, in the fall of 2023, I had taken the ring out of the bag and I had washed it carefully in warm water and a soft cloth, and I had placed it in the velvet box that I bought specifically for it, and I had put the box on the top shelf of the closet behind the gray sweater. I had not looked at it again until this moment, sitting in my car outside my parents' house, knowing that it was sitting in a safe in a pawn shop on Indian School Road, and knowing that my own sister had put it there, and knowing that I was about to walk through a series of decisions that would change the rest of my life. I started the engine. I drove the 18 minutes from the neighborhood of my parents to the Indian School Road store, and I parked in the lot behind the building, and I sat in the car for another minute looking at the back of the building, where Daniel and I had once stood together on a Saturday morning in 2021, reviewing the contractor estimate for the new awning. The green awning that Marlo had described to me, the awning that had been the visual landmark by which she had identified the store, had been chosen by my husband from a sample book on a folding table inside the empty storefront before the renovation began. He had picked green because it was my favorite color. He had not told me that at the time. I had only learned it later from a Manny after he was gone. I walked around to the front of the building, and I let myself in through the glass door, and the brass bell rang above my head, and Devin Castellanos looked up from the counter, and his face changed when he saw me. He was 26 years old, the son of Salvadoran immigrants who had settled in Mesa in the 1990s, and he had a small tattoo of his grandmother initials on the inside of his left wrist that he had shown me once during a store visit. He came around the counter, and he did not say anything at first because he could see, in the way I was holding my shoulders, that I was not in a place where small talk would help. He just walked to the back office and unlocked the safe, and he came back out with the velvet box in his hands, and he placed it on the counter in front of me. I opened the box. The ring was inside, exactly the way I had last seen it, the brushed white gold catching the overhead light, the engraving still legible along the inside of the band, the date October 17th, and the year of our wedding spelled out in small, careful letters. I picked it up. I held it in my palm for a moment. I closed my hand around it, and I felt the metal warm against my skin, and I felt my eyes fill with water, and I did not blink because I did not want to cry inside my own store in front of my own employee. Devin, sensing this, very quietly excused himself to the back office and gave me 60 seconds alone with the counter and the ring and the small overhead light. When he came back, I had composed myself, and I asked him to walk me through the intake process exactly as it had happened. He told me that Marlo had come in at 4:14 and had asked to speak to someone about pawning a ring, and that he had taken her to the jewelry counter, and that she had handed over the velvet box and her driver license, and that he had opened the box and seen the engraving and immediately recognized the date, because there was a framed photograph on the wall of my office at the corporate building that showed Daniel and me on our wedding day with the date written along the bottom of the frame. He told me that he had not said anything to Marlo about the recognition. He had simply processed the intake the way he would process any intake. He had written up the ticket, he had given her the cash from the drawer, and he had walked her to the door. Then he had gone into the back office, and he had photographed every document and emailed it to Manny with a note marked urgent. I asked him why he had not called me directly. He looked at the floor, and he said that he had not wanted to interrupt my day with bad news if there was a chance the ring was not actually mine, and that he had wanted to verify the engraving against the photograph in my office before he raised the alarm. Imani had confirmed the match within the hour, and they had both decided to hold the ring in the safe and wait for my next move. He apologized for not calling me sooner. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. I told him he had done exactly the right thing in exactly the right order, and that I would be making sure his discretion did not go unrewarded. I put the ring back in the box. I put the box in my purse. I asked Devin to print me a copy of the intake form and the security footage and the photocopy of the driver license of Marlo, and to put a corporate flag on her name across the entire chain, so that if she ever walked into any of my 47 locations again, the system would alert the on-duty supervisor and the transaction would be denied. He nodded. He printed the documents. He handed them to me in a manila folder. I thanked him. I walked back out through the brass bell and into the parking lot, and I sat in my car with the folder on my lap, and I made the second hard phone call of the evening, this one to my personal attorney, a woman named Briar Whitfield who had handled the estate of Daniel and who had become, over the course of 3 years, one of the few people in my life who knew the full shape of my circumstances. Briar picked up on the first ring because I had not called her after business hours in over a year, and she knew that I would not be calling now unless something was wrong. I told her what had happened. I told her about the ring, about the ticket, about the conversation in the living room, about the crumpled paper in the sofa cushions, about the words my parents had used, and the words my sister had used, and the words I had used in response. Briar listened without interrupting. When I was done, she asked me one question, and the question was, "What do you want to do?" I sat in the car for a long moment with the folder on my lap, and the ring in my purse, and the orange sky fading to purple above the parking lot, and I thought about my husband, and I thought about my mother, and I thought about every single year of my life that I had spent making myself smaller so that other people could feel larger. And I gave Briar my answer. I told Briar that I wanted to file a formal report with the Phoenix Police Department for grand theft, because the ring had been valued at slightly over $4,000 by an independent jeweler for insurance purposes in 2023. And because the legal threshold for grand theft in Arizona was $1,000. And because I was tired of pretending that what my sister had done was a family matter that could be handled with a stern conversation. Briar was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. She did not try to talk me out of it. She had known me long enough to know that I did not make decisions like this lightly, and she had also known me long enough to know that when I did make them, I had already thought through the consequences. She asked me when I wanted to file. I told her tomorrow morning, the 13th of March, at 9 a.m., and she said she would meet me at the precinct. I drove home that night through streets I had driven 1,000 times, past the gas station, where Daniel and I used to stop for coffee on Sunday mornings, past the diner where we had eaten breakfast on the day we signed the papers on our first house, past the elementary school where Marlo and I had once sat together on the same swing set in the summer of 1997 and shared a popsicle that our mother had brought us in a small cooler. I had loved my sister, once. I had loved her in the uncomplicated way that an older sister loves a younger sister, who has not yet revealed her full character. I had bought her birthday presents and helped her with her math homework and let her wear my clothes and covered for her with our parents when she came home past curfew in high school. I had done all of these things because I believed that the love of a sister was a permanent structure that could absorb a certain amount of damage without falling down. I was beginning to understand that night that I had been wrong about the structure. I had been wrong about a lot of things. I pulled into the driveway of my house, the same house Daniel and I had bought together in 2021, a small stucco bungalow with a tile roof in a quiet neighborhood in North Phoenix, and I sat in the car for another long minute before I went inside. The house was dark. I had not left any lights on that morning because I had not expected to be coming home this late. I let myself in through the side door, and I set my purse on the kitchen counter, and I took the velvet box out and I set it on the counter next to the purse, and I stood there looking at it for a long time. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened my laptop and I began to write a document, not for any specific purpose, but because writing things down has always been the way I think through them. I wrote a list of every time in my life that my mother had taken something of mine and given it to Marlo. The list started when I was 7 years old, when my mother had given Marlo the porcelain doll that my grandmother had sent me for Christmas, because Marlo had cried that her own doll was not as pretty. The list continued through my childhood, my teenage years, my early 20s. It included a college fund that had been split 50-50 between us, despite the fact that only my paychecks from a high school job had contributed to it. It included a car that had been promised to me and then given to Marlo. It included a piece of jewelry from my grandmother that had been redirected to Marlo at the funeral in January of this year, 2 months before the events of that Tuesday evening. The list, by the time I finished it, was 47 items long. I noticed the number with a small flat humor because 47 was also the number of stores in my chain, and the symmetry felt like the universe was making a small dry joke at my expense. I closed the laptop. I drank the rest of my tea. I went to bed in the room that I had shared with Daniel for the last year of his life, and I slept badly, and I woke at 6 in the morning to a sky the color of a bruise and a phone full of missed calls and text messages. There were 11 missed calls from my mother. There were 6 from my father. There were 4 from Marlo. There were 2 from my Aunt Theodora, the younger sister of my mother, who lived in Tucson and who had clearly been recruited overnight as a reinforcement. There was 1 from my Uncle Branford, the brother of my father, who I had not spoken to in 2 years and who had no business calling me about anything. The text messages were a more interesting study. The ones from my mother had started conciliatory and become increasingly hostile over the course of the night. The ones from Marlo had started defiant and become increasingly panicked. The ones from my father were short and angry and identical in tone to the ones he had sent me when I was 19 and had refused to come home for Thanksgiving because I wanted to spend it with the family of my college boyfriend. I read all of them. I did not respond to any of them. I got out of bed. I made myself breakfast. I showered. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit that I had bought for a quarterly board meeting in February, and I put my hair up in a low knot at the back of my neck, and I drove downtown to the Phoenix Police Department headquarters, where Briar was waiting for me in the lobby with a leather portfolio under her arm and a small reassuring nod that she gave me when I walked through the glass doors. We sat in a small conference room with a detective named Marcellus Yarborough, a tall man in his late 40s with graying temples and a calm professional manner, and I walked him through the events of the previous 48 hours in the same level voice I had used in the living room. I gave him the manila folder. He looked through it slowly. He asked me clarifying questions about the time stamps on the security footage, about the chain of custody of the velvet box, about the relationship between me and the suspect. He used the word suspect, and the word landed on the table between us with a small heavy thud that I noticed but did not flinch at. Marlo was a suspect. That was the legal category she had placed herself into when she walked into my store with my ring. Detective Yarborough asked me whether I was sure I wanted to proceed with charges, because in family theft cases, there was often a possibility of restitution and reconciliation outside the criminal system. He said this in the gentle tone of a man who had seen a lot of family disputes flame out into formal complaints and then be withdrawn 3 days later when the families patched things up over a holiday dinner. I told him I was sure. I told him that I had spent 34 years of my life inside a family that took from me, and that I was not going to spend a single additional day of my life pretending that the taking was love. Breyer nodded next to me. The detective wrote down my statement, asked me to sign it, and told me that they would be contacting Marlowe within the next 24 hours to bring her in for questioning. I walked out of the precinct at 10:40 a.m. The sun was bright. The sky was clear. I felt, for the first time in 3 years, like I was standing inside my own body instead of next to it. Breyer walked me to my car, and she squeezed my arm before she let me go, and she told me that the next few weeks were going to be hard, and that I was going to want to second-guess myself 100 times, and that she was going to be there every time I needed to be reminded of why I had made this choice. I thanked her. I got in the car. I drove to the corporate office, and I rode the elevator up to the 12th floor, and I walked into my office, and I closed the door, and I sat at my desk, and I looked at the framed photograph of Daniel and me on our wedding day with the date written along the bottom of the frame. I told him what I had done. I said the words out loud in the empty office with the door closed and the blinds half drawn. I told him I had filed a police report against my sister. I told him I had taken the ring back. I told him I was not going to apologize for any of it. And then I sat in the chair for a long time, and I waited for the next phone call, because I knew, the way you know the weather is about to change, that one was coming. The call came at 12:17 in the afternoon, from my mother. And I let it go to voicemail, because I was in the middle of a meeting with Manny and our regional manager for the Las Vegas market about the quarterly inventory audit. And I had made a private rule for myself that morning that I was not going to interrupt my work for any member of my family unless someone was bleeding. The voicemail was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long, which was a personal record for my mother, and I did not listen to it until I was back at my desk an hour later with the door closed and a fresh cup of coffee in front of me. The message began with my mother weeping, which was a new tactic in her arsenal because she had not wept in front of me since the funeral of my grandmother in January. She wept for about 30 seconds, and then she pivoted, in the seamless way she always pivoted, into anger. She said that the police had come to the house, that 2 officers in uniform had knocked on the front door at 11:15 in the morning and asked to speak with Marlowe, and that Marlowe had been brought to the precinct for questioning, and that this was the most humiliating thing that had ever happened to our family, and that I had betrayed the people who raised me, and that I would never be welcome in her house again unless I called the police department immediately and withdrew the complaint. She said the phrase "the people who raised me" 4 separate times in the voicemail. I counted them. She also used the word ungrateful 7 times and the word selfish 9 times, and by the end of the message she was no longer crying, she was simply listing the inventory of my moral failings in the calm voice of a woman reading items off a grocery list. I deleted the voicemail. I did not respond. I went back to work. The afternoon passed in the small, steady rhythm of meetings and emails, and a brief phone call with a vendor about a new line of insurance products we were considering for the jewelry intake process. At 4 p.m., Breyer called me to tell me that Marlowe had been formally charged with grand theft and released on her own recognizance, and that her arraignment was scheduled for the 24th of March, 11 days from now. Breyer told me that the prosecutor had reviewed the file and was confident in the case, and that the evidence was clean, and that unless something unexpected happened, Marlowe was looking at probation, restitution, and a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. I thanked Breyer. I hung up. I sat at my desk for a long time staring at the wall. There is a particular kind of weight that arrives when you realize that you have just irreversibly changed the life of someone you used to love, and that weight settled onto my shoulders that afternoon in a way I had not been prepared for. I was not going to change my mind. I knew that. But I also knew that I was going to have to carry this weight for a long time, and that no amount of being right was going to make the weight lighter, and that the people in my life who would have helped me carry it were not the people in the voicemail. At 5:30 p.m., I packed up my things and I rode the elevator down and I walked to my car, and as I was crossing the parking garage, I saw a figure standing next to my driver's side door. It was Marlowe. She was wearing a hoodie pulled up over her hair, and she had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and her eyes were red, and her makeup was smudged in the way that suggested she had been crying for several hours. She did not say anything when I walked up. She just stood there, blocking the door, waiting for me to acknowledge her. I stopped about 6 feet away. I did not put down my bag. I asked her, in a calm voice, how she had gotten into the parking garage of a building she did not work in, and she said that she had told the security guard at the entrance that she was my sister and had a family emergency, and the guard had let her through. I made a small mental note to have a conversation with the building security about that policy. Then I asked her what she wanted. She said she wanted to talk. I told her that anything she wanted to say to me, she could say through her lawyer, because anything she said to me directly could be used in the prosecution, and I was not going to give her the chance to manipulate me into a withdrawn complaint. She started to cry. She said that she was sorry, that she had not understood what she was doing, that Pierce had pressured her into it because he needed the money for a credit card payment, that our mother had told her it was a good idea, that she had not meant to hurt me. I listened to all of this without saying anything. The list of people she was blaming was getting longer with every sentence. And by the time she got to the end, she had mentioned 5 different people who had been responsible for her decision to walk into my store with my husband ring, and not one of those 5 people was Marlo herself. I had been an older sister for 32 years, and I had heard every version of this speech. And I had once believed that the inability to take responsibility was a kind of innocence, and I had once forgiven it as such. I did not forgive it anymore. I told her quietly that I was sorry she was going through a hard time and that I hoped she got the help she needed and that I was not going to drop the charges. She stopped crying. The shift was immediate. She uncrossed her arms and she stepped closer to me, and she lowered her voice into the cold register she had inherited from our mother, and she told me that I was going to regret this, and that the family was going to make sure I regretted it, and that there were things she could tell people about me that I would not want told. I asked her what things. She did not answer specifically. She just said that I had secrets too, and that she knew them, and that I should not pretend to be better than her when I was just as bad in my own way. I waited for her to be specific. She was not specific. The threat was the kind of threat that a person makes when they have nothing actual to threaten with, but they want to leave the impression that they might, and I had been around enough negotiation tables in the last 3 years to recognize the move. I told her that if she had something specific to say, she should say it, and otherwise she should step away from my car. She did not step away. She just stood there with her arms crossed and her chin lifted. And for a moment, I saw the 9-year-old girl who had eaten my birthday cake, and I felt a small, unexpected wave of sadness for both of us, for the sisters we might have been if our mother had not raised us to compete for scraps that she could have given to both of us without diminishing either. Then the wave passed. I walked around to the passenger side of my car, I let myself in through the passenger door, I climbed across the center console to the driver's seat, and I started the engine. Marlo watched me through the window. She did not move out of the way of the driver's side door even as I put the car in reverse, and I had to back out slowly while she stood there, and I think she expected me to roll down the window and say something else, and I did not, because I had said everything I needed to say. I drove home. I made myself dinner. I sat at the kitchen table, and I ate a chicken breast and a small pile of roasted vegetables and a glass of water, and I read a novel I had been meaning to read for 6 months, and I went to bed at 10 p.m., and I slept for 9 hours without waking up once. It was the best sleep I had gotten in 3 years. When I woke up the next morning, the 14th of March, my phone had 18 new messages on it from various members of the extended family, and I did not read a single one of them. I made coffee. I went to work. The chain of pawn shops that my husband had built and that I had grown continued to operate at all 47 locations across 2 states, and the sun came up over Phoenix the way it always did, and I went on with my life. The arraignment was scheduled for 9 a.m. on the 24th of March, in courtroom number 4B at the Maricopa County Superior Court, and I sat in the 3rd row of the gallery with Breyer on one side of me and Imani on the other. And I watched my sister stand at the defense table next to a public defender whose name I never caught. Marlo was wearing a navy blue dress that our mother had clearly picked out for her, and her hair was pulled back into a small, neat bun, and she did not look in my direction once during the entire proceeding. My mother and father were sitting in the front row of the gallery on the other side of the aisle, and they did not look at me either, although I could feel my mother's attention pulsing across the aisle like the heat from a small, focused lamp. The arraignment lasted 11 minutes. Marlo pleaded not guilty, which I had expected, because pleading not guilty was the strategy any defense attorney would have recommended at this stage, even though the evidence was clean and the case was straightforward. The judge set a pretrial conference for the 8th of April and released Marlo on continued recognizance with the condition that she have no contact with me directly or through any third party. The judge said the word "me" by reading my name from the file, and I noticed my mother flinch when she heard the full legal version of my name spoken aloud in the courtroom, because the full version included my married name, the name I had taken when I married Daniel, the name that my mother had refused to use in the 3 years since his death because she preferred to pretend that the marriage had been a temporary detour rather than the central event of my adult life. We filed out of the courtroom in 2 separate streams, my side going left and theirs going right, and we did not make eye contact in the lobby. I rode the elevator down with Briar and Amani, and we walked out into the bright, cold morning air of late March in Phoenix, and Briar told me that the next major date would be either a plea negotiation or a trial, and that her best guess was that the public defender would push for a plea deal because the evidence was overwhelming. I thanked her. I told her I trusted her judgment. We parted ways on the sidewalk, and Amani and I walked back to the corporate office, and I went up to my office, and I closed the door, and I sat in my chair, and I did the small private work of putting my face back together after a difficult morning. The 2 weeks between the arraignment and the pretrial conference were the strangest 2 weeks of my adult life. The family, having failed to break me through direct confrontation, switched to a campaign of indirect pressure. My Aunt Theodora drove up from Tucson and showed up at my office without an appointment, and the receptionist Lavinia called me on the intercom and asked whether I wanted to take the visitor, and I said no and asked her to escort my aunt out of the building. My aunt sent me a long email that evening explaining that I was destroying the family, and I deleted it without responding. My Uncle Branford left a voicemail saying that he was disappointed in me, and I deleted the voicemail. A cousin I had not spoken to since 2019 sent me a long Facebook message that I did not read. The most surprising contact came from my father, who appeared at my house on the evening of the 2nd of April, a Wednesday, at around 7:30 p.m., just as I was finishing dinner. He rang the doorbell. I looked at him through the peephole for a long moment before I decided whether to open the door. I had not been alone in a room with my father, just the 2 of us, in probably 15 years. He had always been the silent partner in my mother campaigns, the figure in the armchair who nodded along and provided occasional one-liners of disapproval, and I had not thought of him as a person with his own interior life since I was a teenager. I opened the door. He stood on the porch in his old brown jacket and his work boots, and he did not say hello, he just asked if he could come in. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. I made him a cup of coffee because that was what I had been raised to do, and he held the cup in both hands and he did not drink from it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me, in a low voice, that he had not known about the ring until Marlo walked into the living room with it, and that he had said the things he had said because he had not known what else to say, and that he had been thinking about it every day since, and that he was sorry. I was not prepared for the apology. I had not built a defense against it because I had not believed any of them was capable of one. I sat across from him at the kitchen table, and I looked at the lines on his face that had deepened in the last 3 years, and I thought about the man he had been when I was a child. The man who had taught me to ride a bicycle in the driveway and who had taken me fishing at the lake outside the city on Saturday mornings before Marlo was old enough to come along. The man who had been my father before he became the husband of my mother in the more complete and absorbing sense. I asked him why he had said what he said about Daniel. He looked down at the coffee cup. He told me that he had not known how to grieve for a son-in-law because he had not known how to grieve for anyone, and that his own father had died when he was 11, and that no one in his family had ever talked about it, and that when Daniel died, he had simply not had the vocabulary to be useful to me, and that my mother had told him that the best way to help me was to push me forward, and he had believed her because he had always believed her, and that it had taken, until the night I walked out of the living room for him to begin to question whether what she had been telling him for 40 years about how to be a person was actually correct. I did not know what to do with this. I sat at the table and I drank my own coffee slowly and I let him talk. He did not ask me to drop the charges. He did not defend Marlo. He did not defend my mother. He did not ask me for anything at all. He just sat at the table, and he told me, in a voice that grew quieter as he went, that he had spent his entire marriage being the kind of father he thought my mother wanted him to be, and that he had failed me as a result, and that he did not expect me to forgive him, and that he just wanted me to know that he saw what had happened, and that he was not going to pretend anymore that it had not. I did not forgive him in that moment. I did not need to. I told him that I appreciated him coming over, and I told him that I needed time, and I told him that if he wanted to have a different kind of relationship with me going forward, that was something we could explore slowly, but that it would have to start with him deciding what he believed independently of my mother, and that I was not going to be the project that brought him to that decision. He nodded. He drank a little of the coffee. He stood up to leave. At the door he paused, and he looked at me, and he said that Daniel had been a good man and that he should have said so when Daniel was alive, and that he was sorry for that too. He left. I closed the door behind him, and I leaned my back against it, and I cried for the first time since the night in the living room. I cried for the father I had wanted as a child and had not gotten. I cried for the husband I had loved and had lost. I cried for the sister I had once had and did not have anymore. I cried until I was tired, and then I went to bed, and I slept again the deep, clean sleep of a person who has finally stopped carrying something they were never supposed to be carrying alone. The pretrial conference happened on the 8th of April, and Breyer called me afterward to tell me that the public defender had requested a plea negotiation, and that the prosecutor was open to a deal that involved a guilty plea to a reduced charge of misdemeanor theft, 2 years of supervised probation, full restitution for the value of the ring plus court costs, 60 hours of community service, and mandatory enrollment in a financial responsibility class. Breyer asked me how I felt about it. I asked her what she would advise. She told me that the deal was reasonable, that it secured a conviction on the record without the time and emotional cost of a trial, that the conditions were appropriate to the offense, and that the restitution would not actually reach me through the criminal court because I had insurance coverage on the ring, but that the symbolism of the order would matter. I told her to take the deal. We were not in this for the money. We were in this for the record, for the formal acknowledgement in a public document that my sister had taken something from me and that what she had taken had been worth something. The ring was already back in my possession. The damage to the family was already done. What I needed from the legal system was a piece of paper that said, in black ink on white paper, that I had been right to draw the line where I drew it, and that no one in my family could ever again rewrite the events of that Tuesday afternoon to make me the villain of a story I had not started. The plea was entered on the 17th of April, a Thursday, in the same courtroom 4B with a different judge. Marlowe stood at the defense table, and she said the word guilty out loud, and the court reporter typed it into the official record. I was sitting in the third row again, this time alone, because Breyer had not needed to be there for the formal entry, and Amani had a meeting I had not wanted her to cancel. My mother was in the front row. My father was not. He had told me on the phone the night before that he was not going to attend, and that he had told my mother he was not going to attend, and that this had caused a fight in their house that was probably still going on. I had not asked for details. I had just thanked him and told him I would see him another time. After the plea, I walked out of the courthouse, and I stood on the steps for a moment in the warm April sun, and I felt a small clean wave of something that was not exactly happiness, but was adjacent to it. A sense of completion, the sense that a long and difficult sentence had finally reached its final period. I walked to my car. I drove to a small bakery on Camelback Road that Daniel and I used to visit on Sunday mornings, and I bought myself a slice of lemon cake and a cup of black coffee. And I sat at a small table by the window, and I ate the cake slowly, and I watched people walk by on the sidewalk outside. A woman about my age sat down at the table next to mine with her own slice of cake, and we made the small, polite eye contact that strangers make in bakeries, and she smiled at me, and I smiled back. She did not know anything about me. She did not know that I had just come from a courtroom where my sister had pleaded guilty to stealing my dead husband ring. She did not know that I owned 47 pawn shops. She did not know any of the things that had taken up so much space in my mind for the past 5 weeks. She just saw a woman in a charcoal suit eating a slice of lemon cake on a Thursday afternoon, and she smiled at me the way one stranger smiles at another, and the smile was a small, unexpected gift. I went back to the office. I worked until 6 p.m. I drove home. I made myself dinner. The rhythms of my life were settling back into something that resembled normal, but it was a different normal than the one I had been living in before. The phone calls from my mother had stopped after the arraignment, when she had finally accepted that I was not going to be moved by guilt or anger. The text messages from various aunts and uncles and cousins had tapered off. The family WhatsApp group that I had been muted from sometime in late March had reformed itself without me. And I knew this because my cousin Adeline, the only member of the extended family who had reached out to me with actual support, had screenshotted a few of the messages and sent them to me with brief, sympathetic notes. Adeline was the daughter of my Aunt Theodora, and she was 3 years older than me, and she had been quietly estranged from her own mother for the better part of a decade for reasons that paralleled mine in surprising ways. She called me on the evening of the 19th of April, and we talked for almost 2 hours. She told me that the family had been processing my decision in a series of escalating stages, and that the current stage was something she described as cold containment, in which my name was being mentioned only in clipped contexts, and the decision had been made to treat me as a kind of cautionary tale rather than a current family member. She told me, with a small dry laugh, that I had achieved what she had been trying to achieve for years, which was to be left alone. I asked her how she had managed it. She told me that the secret was not to engage, not even to defend myself, not even to clarify the record, because every engagement gave the family fresh material to work with. My cousin Adeline advised me to use silence against my manipulative family. She learned this during her own divorce in 2018. We became close friends. In April, I received a short note from my mother admitting she was wrong. I did not reply, following the advice of Adeline. During the hot summer of 2025 in Phoenix, I expanded the pawn shop business of my late husband Daniel to 49 locations. I also resumed grief counseling with Dr. Inez Marquette to process my family trauma. Inez advised me to find a middle ground in my family relationships rather than choosing total reconciliation or total estrangement. I maintained brief, consistent contact with my father, who was learning to be a better parent. I had no contact with my sister Marlo due to her probation. In August, I visited the grave of Daniel. I spoke to him about my life and felt at peace. In late August, I received a long, genuine apology letter from my mother. She explained she was in therapy and finally understood how she had hurt me. I kept the letter in my desk but did not reply. I realized the choice to forgive her was entirely mine to make when I was ready. It is now October 2025. I work in my home office and wear the wedding ring of Daniel on a chain around my neck. I continue to meet my father for coffee every Sunday. The pawn shop chain of Daniel recently opened its 49th location in Nevada, honoring his memory. I have built a peaceful life from my grief. The cousin of mine and I have continued our regular dinners. We had dinner last Tuesday at a small Italian place near her apartment, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. And she told me that her own mother had recently started reaching out to her for the first time in years, and we talked about what that meant and what to do with it. The friendship of my cousin is one of the things I would never have found if my family had not finally cracked open in the way that it did. And I think about this often when I am tempted to wish that the events of March had not happened. The events of March happened. They cost me a relationship with my mother and a relationship with my sister, and they gave me a relationship with my father and a relationship with my cousin and a relationship with myself. And the math of it is not even, but the math of it is mine. I think about Marlo sometimes. I do not miss her, exactly, but I think about her, in the way you think about a person who used to occupy a particular chair at a particular table and is no longer there. Her probation continues. Breyer tells me that she has been in compliance with all the conditions, and that she has been attending the financial responsibility class diligently, and that the soup kitchen in Glendale has reported positively on her community service. I do not know what is happening inside her. I do not know whether she has begun the work of looking at her own life with any honesty, or whether she is simply waiting for the probation to end so she can go back to being who she was before. I hope, in a distant and not particularly invested way, that she does the work. I have stopped feeling responsible for the outcome. The ring on the chain around my neck is the small daily reminder of what I am no longer willing to lose. I have learned, in the 7 months since that Tuesday afternoon in March, that boundaries are not walls. They are not the way you keep love out. They are the way you make love possible. They are the small, clear lines that say, "This is mine and this is yours, and what I share with you I share by choice, and what you take from me without asking is not love. It is theft, and theft has a name and a category and a legal definition no matter who is doing it." I had to learn this at 34 years old, in a courtroom and on a sofa and at a kitchen table with my father, and I wish I had learned it sooner, but I am grateful to have learned it at all. If you are watching this, and you have a family that takes from you and calls it love, I want you to know that you are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to draw it without explaining it. You are allowed to draw it even if the people on the other side of the line are the people who raised you. You are allowed to draw it even if they tell you that drawing it makes you ungrateful or selfish or cold. The line is the only thing that protects the part of you that is still capable of love, and without the line, eventually, that part will be drained dry, and you will not be able to love anyone, including yourself, in the way you were meant to. I want you to know that the cost of drawing the line is real. I lost a sister. I lost, for some period of time and possibly forever, the version of my mother I had spent 34 years trying to earn. I lost the family WhatsApp group and the holiday dinners and the comfortable lie that everything was fine. But what I gained is also real. I gained the ring back. I gained a relationship with a father I had not known I could have. I gained a friendship with a cousin who understood me without explanation. I gained the small daily peace of waking up in a house where no one is going to take anything from me without asking. And I gained, most importantly, the knowledge that the woman my husband married was capable of protecting the things he left her, and that he would have been proud of me, and that I am proud of myself. The pawn shop chain that my husband built will continue to grow. The 50th location will open sometime in early 2026, and I have already begun the search for the right space. The ring on the chain around my neck will continue to be the small, warm presence against my collarbone. The letter from my mother will continue to sit in the drawer until I decide what to do with it. The Sunday afternoons with my father will continue. The dinners with my cousin will continue. The life I am building will continue. One small, ordinary day at a time, and it will not look like the life I thought I was going to have when I was 24 and walking down the aisle toward a man in a gray suit who was smiling at me like I was the only person in the world. But it will be mine, and it will be honest, and it will be enough. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for listening to a story that I never thought I would be able to tell out loud. If something in it resonated with you, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you have your own story about a moment when you finally drew a line with the people who were supposed to love you, I would love to read about it in the comments. The line is hard to draw. The line is worth drawing. And you are not alone on the other side of it.